So, how cities and state came about? The first and mandatory condition was food production. The emergence of cities and later states came in the wake of the agricultural revolution. By merely gathering and hunting, populations didn't grow in numbers and complexity. It was only with the beginning of the production of food, with the agricultural revolution, that we were in the process to move into the establishment of cities and states. But food production on its own didn't make all of the work. It was necessary to take aside the unconsumed food that food production generated, and with this surplus sustain the part of the population that did not work on agricultural production. So we have this transition into surplus taking, which is the very beginning of tributary societies. Those people working in food production give away part of the production, the part that was not necessary for their own sustenance, and this surplus was transferred into the new emerging elite. Now, how it was that a new emerging elite was able to grab this surplus of production? Well, by one of two means. Either coercion, that is threat of force, threat of using force, or actually deploying the force to take it, or consent, that is convincing the producers that it's for their own well-being that they should be giving up the surplus of their production. The coercion and consent couple is oftentimes referred as the metaphor of the stick and the carrot. So you have the horse going by either threatening him with a long stick or by alluring him further with a carrot. And this is the combination that set agriculturalists to give up a portion of their production. And it will be this moment that will grant the transition from these small bands and tribes into chiefdoms and states. In other words, the emergence of the states is characterized by this concentration of a monopoly of the means of violence by a small elite or a small group that is able to rule on a large and dense agricultural population. When it comes to look into the coercion or the stick as opposed to the consent or the carrot, we need to realize that the more an elite invests in the coercion, the most force it needs to use, or the more force it needs to accumulate for threatening using, the more waste of resources goes in that direction. For an emerging elite, it's much more effective to gain consent, to convince people to give away their surplus. And this is done when there is legitimacy for their rule, there is legitimacy for their act of tribute taking. And in order to gain this legitimacy, in order to base this consent, we run into a period in which new emerging orders come into the place. You recall that the cognitive revolution brought about the fictional thinking. The fictional thinking allowed for create imagined orders, construct realities. You remember how the hunters and gatherers had this sort of imagination in their animistic beliefs, and how the agriculturalists move into the notion of a theistic beliefs in which there are multiple gods in commands of the different spheres of nature. Now we are having this emerging elite that will harness those beliefs in gods to place themselves as intermediaries between the bulk of the population and the ruling gods. So either they were meant to be the sons of the gods, or the representatives of gods, or intermediates of gods, or even they portrayed themselves as God themselves. And within this new imagined order, it made sense to pay the tribute to the ruling elite, which otherwise would use its innate force to take the surplus as well. So one of these expressions of the new imagined order we found in the Code of Hammurabi from about 1750 before the Common Era, in which one ruler portrays himself as the law-giving authority, and society follows through this imagined order in which one person is entitled to establish the rules of behavior for the community at large. When it comes to explain why is that states emerged, you won't be surprised at this point in the course that there are several theories, several explanations, and that they not necessarily are mutually exclusive. One of the lines of explanations have to do with population pressure. So you recall that the agricultural revolution triggered a demographic explosion, a fast-paced population growth, and with that population growth there was a pressure for arable land. The demand of land, the way in which land was highly valued, increased the effort to control land, resulting in some people able to master big tracts of land, with others left behind, that resulting in a polarization in society, in a stratification in which some people had large tracts of land and others none. And there was a need for this proprietor class to protect itself from the unprivileged, landless population, and in order to create this protection system, a state came into being. That is, those warriors with the monopoly in the use of weaponry to protect the land-owning elite. A second type of argument for the explanation of the emergence of the state has to do once again with population pressure, but in this case the way in which the state role is portrayed is much more positive. So this same demand of land resulted in many disputes as there was an intensification in the competition for land, and the disputes needed the arbitration of an authority that was above the contending parts. And this authority, placing itself above the contending parts, this authority is the state. An additional constructive role that the state had in this contestation for land was the establishment of large public works, particularly works of irrigation that enhance the productivity of the land. A third line of argumentation for the emergence of the state, based on the notion of the population pressure, on which all of these explanations agree, is that as the fertile areas were filled up, there were attempts to conquer more lands beyond the boundaries under the domain of that society. Now, in order to conquer more land, there was a need to organize the conquest enterprise, and the forces organizing those military expeditions, those forces are the core of the emerging state. Now, are these explanations mutually exclusive? Not necessarily. You can envision a political entity, a state, that is fulfilling all of these different tasks, that is subordinating the unprivileged classes, arbitrating in disputes, leading large public works in irrigation, and getting an army organized to conquer more land. Probably different states use these attributes to different degrees. And when we look upon these states, these original states in still a smaller scale, that will hint us for understanding states in a more complex state down the road. So, are states good or bad for society? Well, it depends what kinds of functions these states perform and for whom. Is the state subordinating unprivileged classes? Well, if you are a member of an unprivileged class, you may like the state very little. If you are a member of the privileged class, you may be very fond of state. Is your state conquering more land out of which some will be distributed to you? If that's the case, probably you like your state very much. Is your state unfunctional, unable to conquer more land? In that case, you are probably less fond of your state. And we'll go back through these functions of the states as time passed by, and we'll see how different societies assess differently the contribution made by their state. Now, in order to be able to take tribute, there was a need to put in place a data storaging and processing. That is, if you are about to take tribute from people, you need to record what is that you are taking from whom in order to make this surplus taking efficient. At first, you should imagine a situation in which the use of clay that we mentioned last time, the use of clay was put into good use. You can imagine a vessel of clay in which the tax collectors or the tribute collectors were placing small coins, also made of clay, indicating the kind of contribution made by every person. So those tokens were devised to represent some entity in reality, say a sheep, cattle, wheat, barley, and so on and so forth. So if you have a few ships taking from a particular family. In the vessel representing that family, the amount of tokens in the form of ships represented their contribution. In time, collectors realized that this procedure is very cumbersome, having these vessels full of tokens, and they realized that actually they don't need to fold the clay into a vessel, they just have used the clay tablet, and they don't need to put the tokens into the vessel, but rather they can stamp the tokens into the clay tablet. One step further into the development of this technology, they realized that instead of having the tokens and the tablet and the tokens inserted into the tablets, they can produce the shape of the token directly into the tablets. Long story short, in this process of recording the tribute collection, we land into the development of the first writing system, the cuneiform writing system for data storage and processing. As you can see in this example, this is a clay tablet from about 3,400 to 3,000 years before the present, in which the contribution by a person named Kushin was recorded for the last 37 months of surplus taking. Now, once this writing system was developed entirely for the sake of tribute taking, and now you see how important tribute taking is, how much all of this process is based on the act of tribute taking. Once you have the writing system developed in that sake, you can harness this new technology, namely writing, and put it to use in all different sort of directions, such as legal writing, the idea of Hammurabi and his code, as I mentioned a few moments ago, and even you can take that beyond the scope of immediate functional activities, and put writing to use for literature creation. And in fact, it is in this exact time period and in this same place that the first epic story, Gilgamesh, was written. So, all of these ancient civilizations in Sumer, that is contemporary Iraq, in Pharaonic Egypt, in ancient China, all of them needed to develop techniques of recording and archiving in order to be able to keep records of tribute taking. And as they do that, they generated also schools to teach the scribes the profession of generating those records, and they needed to train also clerks and librarians and accountants in order to have this organized and archived. This process that we observe with the emergence of writing is defined as specialization. We are having some people specializing in new tasks. This specialization is key, and it goes back on this marriage between surplus taking and specialization. The surplus taking allowed a portion of the population to disengage from the work in the fields and to be able to use its time and energy in another activities. We saw that very clearly with the case of the scribers, those that wrote down the records, those that spent years learning the complicated cuneiform system writing, and then came to take the records of the surplus taking. But this process that we can exemplify with the scribers was actually a process that gave birth to a myriad of professions. So we have the priests, those people in charge of mediating between the people, the common people, and the gods. Those peoples who are in charge of forecasting the future, forecasting the seasons, forecasting the weather, and according to that, providing guidance to the widest population. We have the magistrates in all their different capacities, the training they needed in order to fulfill those positions, and the execution of those tasks as they step in those jobs. The officers and warriors specializing in the trade of war, the merchants who are free from working the land in order to be able to transport and sell the produce of the land, the artisans, those that generated the tools needed for the production of food, needed for the needs of warfare, and then all sorts of workers specializing in different fields as well. What is very important to understand is that aside these couple of tribute taking allowing specialization, the moment we have specialization, we are going to run also into stratification. That is the generation of an vertical society which consists of different groups with different specializations, and these different specializations correspond with different degrees of wealth and income. So the most clear-cut distinction in these ancient societies is that between free and enslaved populations. But then even within the free segments of the society, we have at the very top the ruling elite made of warriors and priests. Then we have large landowners, small landowners, and landless workers, with the slaves at the very bottom of this vertical social structure. This is the stratification that replaced the horizontal type of social arrangement we had before the agricultural revolution in the egalitarian hunting and gathering societies. With these transformations in the specialization and stratification, we'll see the emergence of multiple innovations. There is a classic book titled History Begins at Sumer, 39 first in recorded history, and without going throughout the list of the 39, let me just mention this is the time in which bronze metallurgy, well-spun pottery, wheel vehicles, sailing vessels, sculpture, monumental buildings, the plough, weaving and dyeing textiles, measurements, canals and dikes, standing army, writing, libraries and school, all of that emerged, and all of that granted the existence of surplus and the surplus taking and the triggering of the specialization and stratification that allowed. Okay, so if we clearly understand now these notions of food production, tribute taking, specialization, stratification, let's see how that works from the smallest scale into the largest. We have this rural area. We call that the hinterland. We have this enormous rural area from which surplus is extracted. This surplus is channeled by a ruling elite into its center, into its location, that will become the city, where people are not producing food, where people are sustained by the food produced by the others, while they specialize in new professions. This city is becoming the core of the state. This is a city-state. This is a city-state in command of a rural hinterland. From this basic cell, city and its hinterland around, we will move into networks and empires in a moment, once you finish up your question by the hour. So, if you can imagine a landscape in which there are many cells of this kind, many city-states with their respective rural hinterlands, you can envision how trade partnerships emerge between different city-states, because their agricultural products are different, and then the goods from one city-state to the next are exchanged by merchants through some transportation system, with the establishment of markets, with the establishment of some exchange method that can be barter at first and coins later, paving the way for the emergence of banking. All of that facilitated by the protection that the military elite provides. And as these interactions between different cities unfold, you witness the specialization of different cities in different products. And with the specialization of different cities with different products, we also witness the stratification. Some products are more elaborated and therefore more expensive. Some products are in bulk with less value. So the same process that we observe within each society of specialization and stratification in social classes, we start observing in these networks between cities. Cities specialized in different goods, in different trades, and according to the value of their products, they stratify and generate not a social hierarchy, but an economic hierarchy, a regional division of labor between cities, resulting in this economic hierarchy, with some cities and their hinterlands coming to the top of the hierarchy, other moving into the bottom. This continuum of economic hierarchy between cities, city-states, we refer to as core and periphery. Some cities at the very top represent the core, others at the bottom the periphery. So from these single city-states into these networks of cities, you can depict schematically the result. And then if you translate this conceptual reconstruction into the actual historical unfolding, we go back this scenario of the network of cities generating this division of labor and this hierarchy from core to periphery is represented by the cities that emerged between the 5th and the 4th millennia in the Mesopotamia. Now, you can also envision how once these networks of cities are in place, the hierarchy established between them from core to periphery will send some of those cities to the top, and those cities will be willing and able to swallow the other city-states and generate a larger political entity. So the relationship will not be just one of commercial exchange, but actual direct rule that will allow the ruling city-state to directly extract the surplus from the other city-states. And when that move happens, we are in front of a kingdom. Now, this conceptual reconstruction clearly corresponds with the development in Egypt, in which one city-state, Memphis, at the top of the Nile River Delta, was able to take possession of all the other Egyptian city-states and in that way create the first kingdom. Now, when you see a kingdom and when you imagine a landscape made of both city-states and kingdoms, it's easy to realize that a similar dynamic will continue unfolding, in which those kingdoms will compete with one another in order to be able to articulate all of the neighboring kingdoms and city-states under one larger entity. And this is how empires came about. So we have between 1,000 years before the Common Era to 500 before the Common Era, these mega empires coming to the fore, and the most prominent one, the Persian Empire, before the age of the classical empires, which we will be exploring later. So the empire is the largest potential entity made out of this process of swallowing ever larger entities from city-states to kingdoms. But this path of creating an empire is not the one and only. Remember that we discussed so far a development based on the agricultural societies. But the beginning of this class today made us aware of an alternative society, namely the pastoral nomadic society. And pastoral nomadic societies were able to establish their own path to empire as well, because those societies that were based on smaller tribes of nomadic pastoralists, these tribes at times could coalesce into confederations of tribes, particularly when they were getting ready to confront the agriculturalists. And as I mentioned at the beginning of class, the nomadic pastoralist societies had a military advantage, a military edge compared to the agriculturalists. So the modest nomadic tribes, becoming large confederations of nomadic tribes, were able to step in and conquer agricultural kingdoms, and in this way establish empires through this nomadic path to empire. That was actually the case with the Xiongnu Confederation, one of the earliest examples of a nomadic pastoralist confederation able to confront and defeat the United Empire of China. And then there is a third path to empire, which is made by a third type of society that emerged in the wake of city-states. There were some city-states which were maritime in nature, city-states that specialized in navigation. They don't necessarily have their agricultural hinterland, they don't necessarily specialize in the production of a particular commodity, but rather they specialize in the skill to navigate, in the skill to build ships and transport goods from one point to the other. Those maritime societies in which wealth was generated mostly by the service of the maritime activity were connecting with multiple maritime city-states and city-states inland as well, and through this method they generated their own maritime empires. A very early example of that are the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians established multiple city-states in what is today contemporary Lebanon, in Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, and from these city-states they navigated the Mediterranean basin and established additional maritime city-states, and this trade allowed them to establish the very first maritime empire. The Greek city-states will come in their wake and generate an additional maritime empire in the northern shore of the Mediterranean world. So, if we sum up the huge trajectory that we made today with the emergence of city-states as the pillars of networks that later became kingdoms and empires, and we move that into the map, the task that I hand you over at the beginning of class today, you can imagine this planet Earth that once was inhabited only by hunter and gatherer societies, being now divided between hunters and gatherer societies, here in yellow, with agricultural societies, here in green, and these agricultural societies moving into the emergence of city-states, kingdoms and empires, here in blue, and then you have these nomadic and pastoralist societies generating these nomadic confederacies able to create their own empires as well, and finally these maritime city-states that are in time able to generate their own empires. So we move from this map that in the second week was completely yellow, made just of hunters and gatherers societies, into this map that is growing in its complexity. We are having now different type of agents in place. There are still hunters and gatherers, there are many agriculturalists. Some of these agriculturalists already transitioned into the establishment of cities. We have nomadic pastoralists that will soon transition into establishing nomadic confederacies and later empires, and we are having maritime city-states that will generate their own networks and empires. This is becoming a more and more complex global condition around the beginning of the Common Era. And to emphasize how important these two developments that we discussed in the last 2 weeks are, namely the emergence of agriculture and the emergence of cities and states, I want to draw your attention to the fact that when we speak about culture, we go back to the root of the word, the Latin root of the word, which is cultura, namely cultivation. That is, all of this development of culture is actually relying on the radical step of starting cultivating the land. The agricultural revolution is the pivotal moment that allowed for the development of further complexity. When we speak about civilization, we should go back to the Latin root of the word, namely civitas, which means city. So the city-state, this basic cell that I schematically represented for you, is the core of the evolution of these later developments of larger networks, swallowed by kingdoms, swallowed by empires that will grow larger and larger in time, all the way through the 19th century, up to the moment in which some 12 such empires swallowed most of the planet, most of the human population. For that, there is much way to go, but this initial step brings us closer to start understanding how we moved from the agricultural map of plants and animals into our contemporary map of some 200 states. Thank you very much, and see you in person next week.